You will hear a secret the swamp swallowed for decades, and you will learn to recognize the architecture of concealment, where privacy is weaponized and silence becomes law. Imagine a house like a closed fist rimmed by water and reed, where a bell rings at 4 and the people inside answer like soldiers to a commander whose doctrine is bloodline and control. This is the site where Jason forged a legacy by breaking every boundary and by turning family into a private state that policed bodies and births instead of protecting them. Listen as I teach you to read absence like a map. Missing school records, unregistered births, and ghost entries in parish ledgers are signposts, not coincidences. Notice how the landscape itself was an accomplice, how blocked paths and submerged roads became a defensive perimeter that made oversight a rare event. Understand how language became jurisdiction when phrases like pure blood or keep the line were repeated until they acquired the authority of law. The patriarch fashioned rituals to normalize the unnatural weddings. By candlelight became audits, and harvest counts became censuses of heirs. Children learned obedience as craft, and sisters learned their silence as survival. A chapel became an internal court, and a midwife who kept no notes became co-conspirator. Observe how grooming did not only mean physical conditioning, but ideological formation. Memorized prayers and scripts that taught submission and erased dissent. This family perfected staged consent, a rationed permission system, where small rewards reinforced compliance and punishment was routinized so that fear became habit. How many times did neighbors notice and then turn away, caught between charity caution and the cost of interference? This is the calculus that sustains harm. We begin with bodies that show the signature of repeated endogamy, malformed hands, small fragile hearts and eyes that do not trace. Key the world, these bodies are evidence and language. The science arrives late, but it is decisive. Genetics reads patterns of homozygosity and explains why rare conditions cluster in an extended pedigree. Yet before genes, there were mechanical systems, daily routines that hardened into governance, and that made rescue more complicated than a single raid. My promise is to pull you deeper to understand both the human and the structural causes to make you able to see the vector of harm and to act strategically, not emotionally. Hold this first descent as a lens. Learn to see absence and to treat routine visits, records, and registration as weapons of protection and not as bureaucratic chores. We will move from the porch to the ledger, from the chant in the chapel to the clinic where evidence is finally written and where law must learn to translate biology into rights. Power in that compound was manufactured slowly through ritual repetition and through a vocabulary that masked coercion with piety. Study the mechanics and you will see the pattern, a bell at dawn that organizes labor windows that double as watchtowers, and a ledger that lists births as if they were inventory. Control was enforced by chores and by rights. Obedience became a currency, and small privileges were used to train compliance. The women learned to measure their worth by childbearing, and to believe that their bodies were a preservation of lineage rather than a source of individual autonomy. Brothers were raised as wardens, and cousins became the bureaucrats of family law, punishing minor infractions with silence or with staged humiliations that left no visible mark but seared memory. Language was weaponized. Hymns and genealogies were recited to naturalize endogamy and to create a moral firewall against outsiders. This is where grooming becomes structural, not merely interpersonal. It is educational, economic, and spiritual, a triple helix that binds members into a single organism. Education was rationed to protect the narrative literacy given to those who would perpetuate the system and denied to those who might question it. Medical care was instrumentalized. A compliant midwife, an unregistered birth, and a practice of explaining deformity as divine test created a shield against scrutiny. Notice the economic logic. Land kept in kin reduced marriage options and created pressure to keep labor within the clan. In this way, property interests reinforced abuse and secrecy. Neighbors learned a calculus of risk to intervene or not to intervene. Social norms about non-interference became accomplices to concealment. When a community values privacy above oversight, it creates fertile ground for harm, and when bureaucracy is thin, the archive of absence becomes an alibi. Institutions can be gamed when reporting is optional, and when rural outreach is irregular, families like that one operate in the seams of public attention. To dismantle such a system, you must map rituals to vulnerabilities and convert routine administration into protection rather than toleration. Mandate registration checks, enforce school enrollment, and create recurrent interactions that erode the perimeter of enforced solitude. Mobile clinics with pediatric screening and telemedicine. Reduce the cost of oversight and make anomalies visible early when intervention prevents lifelong damage. Train teachers and shopkeepers to see patterns. Chronic absenteeism, delayed vaccinations, and odd purchase patterns are signals, not gossip. Design anonymous reporting channels that trigger discreet welfare visits and ensure that social workers have weather-ready outreach, so geography cannot be an excuse. This is the operational manual for turning private rituals into public checkpoints and for forcing a closed polity to interact with the modern systems that protect. The body becomes evidence when language is silenced and charts replace confessions. In the clinic, the ledger speaks where mouths were muzzled. Clinical records show patterns that the human eye dismissed as tragedy, but that science can decode into causation, recurring anomalies. Microcephaly, polydactyly, congenital heart disease, and immune fragility map onto a history of repeated close kin unions. Genetics lends clarity. It explains homozygosity and the way recessive deleterious alleles amplify across generations. Genetic charts are not cold artifacts. They are testimonial graphs that connect ritual to biological harm. But science alone is not sufficient. It must be ethical, and reparative testing requires consent. When consent is compromised, researchers must include reparation obligations and not only pursue publishable conclusions. Chain of custody protects both evidence and dignity. Blood vials labeled with numbers rather than names travel to university labs where the data may help others. But it must also help the living who were sampled. Design protocols that pair forensic sampling with clinical care. Mandate that grants allocate a share of funds to surgeries, cardiac repairs, and developmental therapies, rather than leaving families in a cycle of medical neglect. Trauma-informed medicine is essential. Clinicians must recognize that victims can distrust healing institutions and that procedural care must restore agency rather than replicate control. Practical logistics matter: cold chain transport for specimens, safe transfer of infants needing surgery, and coordinated telemedicine, links to pediatric specialists. These cost money, but they prevent lifelong impairment. Create community advisory boards that include survivors and local professionals, so research questions align with lived needs, and so that publications cannot extract data without returning infrastructure. Ethical review boards must demand benefit sharing and require timelines for community investment before any genomic paper is accepted for publication. Think long-term genetics is multi-generational, but funding cycles are short. Extend commitments to decades and build capacity in rural hospitals rather than shipping bodies away indefinitely. Clinical testimony carries legal weight, but it must be presented with care. Charts and scans are persuasive because they translate human suffering into measurable variables that juries can understand. Teach expert witnesses to speak plainly and to contextualize probabilities without reducing people to numbers. Humanize testimonies while making the causal mechanisms clear. Insist on protocols for anonymized publication that protect identities while allowing aggregated learning across cases so prevention can scale. Remember that bodies are both evidence and patients, and that ethical science is measured by the care it secures, not by the citations it gathers. This section arms you with the knowledge to demand responsible science and to insist that clinical authority becomes a lever for rehabilitation, not only a tool for prosecution. The law is where private ritual confronts public duty, and where hidden practices must be named and punished in a courtroom narrative of charts, testimony, and pattern. Prosecutors assemble medical scans, social worker reports, and neighbor statements, and stitch them into a chronology that a jury can grasp, while defense invokes culture, privacy, and tradition to blur culpability. Watch the choreography judges instruct jurors on coercion and consent, and provide frameworks for deciding when custom becomes criminal exploitation. The courtroom translates genetics into causation and converts repeated patterns into legal liability. Genetics explains the mechanism, but law defines responsibility. Media attention amplifies the case and forces institutional response. But beware of spectacle, which can expose survivors and convert trauma into commodity rather than into sustained care. At the midpoint of this descent, mark your presence and your commitment to responsibility. Now type shadow forged twice in the comments to seal your witness and to bind your attention to action. Comment. Shadow forged. Comment. Shadow forged. Understand that ritual witnessing matters more than viral outrage. The comment is a token and also a public marker of solidarity that can increase visibility and pressure on institutions to follow through. A verdict can convict, but it cannot alone repair. Childhoods create policy to fund residential care, educational access, genetic counseling, and long-term therapy in the wake of conviction. Design multidisciplinary response teams that pair prosecutors with geneticists, social workers, clinicians, and local liaisons, so evidence triggers care and not merely punishment. Reform statutes to clarify definitions of improper relations, to strengthen mandatory reporting in remote counties, and to create expedited medical pathways for affected children. Sealed records should be transparent in aggregate. Publish redacted data that allow researchers to prevent recurrence while protecting individual identities. Media guidelines must require linking exposure to concrete resources and refusing gratuitous detail that harms recovery. Require commitments from outlets to fund survivor services and to redact identities automatically. Create survivor funds funded by settlements and research grants with binding obligations to deliver long-term services and to provide vocational training and education so survivors can reconstruct autonomous lives on their terms. Courtroom victories must pivot to system building and to oversight mechanisms that last beyond headlines. Quarterly audits, public ledgers, and watchdog coalitions prevent backsliding. This moment of public truth can alter law and allocate resources, but only if your attention does not end with the verdict and becomes persistent organized pressure for reconstruction. Culture is the vector that transmits acceptance for practices that the outside world rejects. Understanding culture is necessary because rituals and myths justify harm and make intervention morally complex. In closed networks, myths about purity and lineage become moral codes, and elders recite origin tales until the narrative becomes law. These stories are mimetic weapons that enforce compliance and stigmatize outsiders. Gender roles are instrumentalized. Daughters are framed as vessels and sons as enforcers, so that policing becomes a family duty rather than an atrocity. Economic logic supports secrecy. Land, staying in kin, reduces marriage options and creates incentives to keep labor and resources internal to the clan. This economic calculation masks abuse as survival. Education is decisive. Mandating school enrollment and literacy for all children removes the cover of invisibility when girls are taught to read and question rituals. They gain exit strategies and capacity to seek help, design outreach that is culturally informed, employ trusted midwives, clergy, and shopkeepers as liaisons who can observe patterns without shaming and who can trigger discreet welfare checks. Create anonymous reporting pathways and ensure social workers respond with dignity, not with punitive removal unless necessary. Initial interventions should stabilize medical needs and build trust. Recovery is long-term. Survivors need sustained housing, medical follow-up, genetic counseling, and trauma-informed therapy, attachment repair, and developmental support are essential for life outcomes. Fund vocational training and scholarships to replace stigma with opportunity. Survivors who once were kept for lineage must be given choice and the power to construct new families on their terms. Media must be disciplined. Coverage should center dignity, link exposure to resource channels, and avoid sensational detail that extracts trauma for clicks. Clergy and shopkeepers must be trained to report and to provide safe shelter when needed. Change social norms so protection becomes honorable and silence becomes suspicious. Support survivor-led organizations that provide peer networks and long-term case management. Survivors must direct program designs so interventions are practical, respectful, and effective. Prevention requires structural investments. Mobile health units, weather, resilient outreach, and digital enrollment systems that work when roads flood and when seasons isolate. Communities measure success by outcomes, school completion, medical milestones, social integration, and reduction in unregistered births. Not by brief spikes in attention. Invest in longitudinal monitoring and publish public ledgers that track agency responsiveness. This cultural work transforms empathy into durable policy and ensures that communities learn to guard children as rights holders rather than as property. Institutions decide what suffering is visible and whose pain receives funding and attention. Grant panels and journals create priorities that often privilege novelty over sustained care. Academic incentives favor papers and prestige, while clinics beg for operating funds to secure heart surgeries and long-term therapies. This mismatch turns human lives into data sets unless corrected, demand funding transparency, and require benefit-sharing clauses so that when biological samples are taken, communities receive direct care and local infrastructure rather than distant papers. Create rapid response teams that pair prosecutors with geneticists, clinicians, and social workers. So evidence triggers comprehensive medical and social interventions quickly, not months later. Implement data governance rules that protect identities while allowing aggregated learning. Anonymized datasets must inform prevention strategies and not be used to stigmatize survivors. Audit agency responsiveness. Publicly publish results and make neglect costly for institutions that ignore remote harm. Build watchdog coalitions of journalists, lawyers, health advocates, and survivors. Change law to clarify definitions of improper relations, coercion, and to provide guidance for judges on factoring long-term manipulation into culpability. Statutory reform must remove cultural excuses when harm to children is evident. Rewire incentives. So prevention and restoration outrank novelty, and prestige require research grants to allocate surgical and therapy budgets to communities that provide samples, design, procurement, and logistics for rural realities, cold chain transport. Telemedicine hubs and pediatric transfer protocols are solvable, but require planning and funds. Train first responders, rural social services, and pediatricians to flag engineered isolation, create weather-ready outreach teams, and equip schools with digital role checks that trigger investigations when anomalies appear, increase accountability by tying university and journal publication to demonstrated community benefit before studies using vulnerable populations are accepted, allocate sustained funds for mobile hospitals, school enrollment drives, and long-term therapeutic services so interventions persist beyond headlines. Fund community-led clinics with multi-year budgeting and require independent audits every 2 years to ensure continuity. Invest in training programs that certify rural clinicians in trauma-informed genetics and in pediatric surgery transfer protocols. Create interagency compacts that guarantee school enrollment checks. Health insurance enrollment and legal oversight are coordinated across county lines. Require philanthropic donors to commit to long-term local partnerships and to provide operating funds. Not just study grants. Establish regional pediatric centers of excellence that can accept transfers within hours and that maintain teleconsultation networks for rural clinicians. Mandate that federal disaster relief includes provisions for continuity of child protection services in flood seasons and storms. Measure success by decades. Not headlines track educational achievement, medical stability, and social integration, and publish progress reports publicly. You have descended with me from a porch creek to the ledger, and now you must carry this knowledge as practice, not as morbid curiosity. Translate awareness into mapping, find missing school records, note unregistered births, list blocked roads, and share that map with trusted social services journalists and nonprofit teams. Train local leaders, clergy, and shopkeepers to report with dignity and to offer shelter rather than silence. Create anonymous channels that trigger welfare checks. Not gossip. Demand law reform and funding for rural mental health, pediatric surgical transfers, and long-term developmental services. Insist that research includes contractual obligations to fund care rather than merely extract data. Build coalitions that hold agencies accountable through public ledgers, quarterly audits, and independent watchdog reports. So neglect becomes visible and costly. Support survivor-centered reporting that channels exposure into resources and protects identity when disclosure endangers recovery. Create survivor funds seeded by settlements and by research grants that require reparative spending. Invest in sustained trauma, informed therapy, and educational continuity. Children with developmental impairments need years of support and vocational training that replaces stigma with opportunity. Sponsor scholarships and apprenticeships so survivors can obtain autonomy and the power to form healthy families on their own terms. Create mobile enrollment campaigns and weather-adapted outreach so geography stops being a shield equip. Schools with digital roll checks and protocols that trigger outreach when anomalies appear. Insist on ethical data sharing agreements where samples and records deliver direct benefit to communities and fund local capacity building, so research leaves infrastructure, not footnotes. Measure change by outcomes, school graduation, medical milestones, and reduction in unregister. Ed births, not by virality or by shock value. Organize local watchdogs, public ledgers, and civic partnerships so promises become visible timelines with measurable deliverables and quarterly reporting. Teach young men stewardship, not silence. Instruct them that true strength is intervention and that protection is honor. Cultivate a culture where citizenship means checking on neighbors rather than looking away. Donate to sustained case management initiatives and volunteer with organizations that do long-term work. not episodic campaigns. Persistence is the cure for spectacle vigilance. Over time protects futures. Not feelings, be relentless and compassionate. Turn outrage into governance act. Now gather evidence, organize allies, and refuse to let another family become a hidden state of harm. Stay steady, keep watch, build systems that outlast headlines and heal generations now and forever.